各位，在这一场围绕着台湾未来的高密度辩论中，出现了一个罕见的结构性时刻。3位来自美国、欧洲与中国大陆的学者同时指出，台湾局势不再只是一个地区的摩擦，而是亚洲力量平衡的核心变量。罗斯从驻台视觉强调了外部干预是不可预测的，而海顿提醒到，地区的军备竞赛已经开始了。而中国学者高志凯只指向一个更敏感的问题，那就是只要日本重新武装，中国将会视为战后秩序的破坏者。这一系列的观点的交叠，正让台海问题变成各国判断结构安全的试金石。真正让辩论升温的是一个反差感极强的事实：外部力量认为自己是利益相关者，但台湾社会内部却维持着一种极其谨慎的现实主义。有专家提到，台湾年轻人普遍不认同中国人身份，但同样拒绝激进的独立。这不是意识形态，而是一种基于力量对比的理性判断。他们清楚，一旦改变现状，首先受到冲击的是岛内的社会。而与此同时，中国大陆重新强调未结束的内战逻辑，把统一视为二战后国际秩序的一部分。两种叙事并存，让台海的问题既情绪化又高度结构化，成为区域最难调和的矛盾。然而最有震撼力的部分来自于日本。辩论中，美国和欧洲的学者多次假设日本可能在危机中发挥核武器，而中国学者高志凯立即反驳，从联合国宪章、敌国条款到战胜国的权利，日本没有重新走向军国主义的空间。这一种观点的正面碰撞，让台海议题迅速外溢，成为日本安全结构的问题。甚至可以说，台湾紧张的程度越高，日本的战略焦虑就越强。中国的逻辑也非常清晰，日本只要敢触碰战争的能力，战胜国的体系仍有法律的权威。这个中西逻辑的差异，正是今天所有误判的源头。讨论最终落到一个关键的问题：如果台湾改变现状，那谁会真正的出兵呢？是美国、日本，还是澳大利亚？没有一个国家愿意给出正确的答案，因为每一位专家都承认一个冷酷的现实：真正的风险不是战争是否爆发，而是一旦爆发，东亚安全结构将会被彻底的重写。从稀土供应链到常规的武器差距，到地理的距离，再到社会的承受力，台海冲突不会是可控的军事行动，而迅速演变成区域性的震荡。所有参与者都在强调，保持现状并不是脆弱，而是唯一减少结构性灾难的方式。让我们看一下视频。
Even if China says it's an internal affair, obviously other countries, not just the United States, but increasingly European countries, Australia, more recently Japan, they consider themselves stakeholders as well. And the reality is that since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, Taiwan and China have been separately governed. That's just a fact. They are separately governed. And the only way to bring about unification would be either a peaceful way or by force. And at the moment, China's position is very clear that they reserve the right to use force. And that's why we see other countries, including here in Taiwan, they're responding to that with their own military moves. Again, that's just a reality. It's not a biased position that I'm stating. I'm just stating the facts that the two sides have been separately governed, and the people are preparing for the possibility that China will use force.
Allow me to emphasize that civil war was never brought to an official end by any means. That is the reality of the separation across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Now, if China ever uses force, it will not be an invasion. It will be a resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And we want to avoid that. We want to achieve unification by peaceful means. But if, for example, as Ross said, other countries want to be stakeholders, to be intervening in this situation, there will be the resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And I don't think any country in the world, including the United States, wants to shed the blood of their soldiers to be involved in a resurrected civil war across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Let's all work together to achieve the peaceful reunification that all of us want, and let's do our best to avoid the resurrection of the unfinished civil war.
Self, if you like, in Taiwan. You ask people, do they feel Chinese? Among the younger generation, it's a tiny, tiny proportion who say they feel exclusively Chinese. But really what the outside world wants is the status quo. What they're worried about is a change of the situation by force, whether that's an actual invasion or some kind of blockade by China. And if that, if there was any change to the status quo, I think it would unleash a whole series of really dangerous dominoes. I think Japan would try to develop nuclear weapons, and it probably has the skills to do so within months. That would probably trigger South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. We'd have all kinds of unforeseen consequences from China taking unilateral action over the status of Taiwan.
Well, whether or not there's a regional arms race, I think, frankly, we're already there. We see that with commitments by Japan and South Korea for significant increases in defense spending. And part of that's in response to North Korea. Part of it's in response, frankly, to China. The Philippines is also dramatically increasing its defense budgets after decades of underinvestment. And here in Taiwan, there's a new proposal for a nearly $40 billion supplemental defense budget, which is an enormous amount of money. So I think the key question is not really what would happen if and when China should use force, or would that set off military spending increases? Because again, I think we're already there. Really, the key question, and I think my colleagues know this, the key question is, should China use force? Would other countries militarily intervene? And that's what caused the controversy after Prime Minister Takachi's remarks about 3 weeks ago in the Japanese parliament. And really, in response to what Victor said about foreign leaders, foreign countries being willing to shed blood, the only thing we could really say about that question is it will be up to the leaders of those countries at the time that this contingency occurs. There's simply no way to predict whether or not the US president or the Japan prime minister or the Australian prime minister, at the time that such an event occurs, would they be willing to dispatch their military and engage in what would be a hot war with China?
Allow me to mention, I'm shocked to hear some of the remarks from the other co-panelists. They talk about Japan as if Japan is in the same line with China. No. If you read the United Nations Charter, there is a particular clause called enemy state, and Japan is an enemy state as far as that clause is concerned, meaning the Japanese government are prohibited from possessing combative weapons of aggression to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China. And if, for example, Japan wants to rearm and to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China, the United Nations Charter authorizes the victor nations to take unilateral military actions against Japan without the need to consult and inform the United Nations Security Council beforehand. That means if you look at China and Japan, they are not equal. One is the country which unconditionally surrendered in 1945. The other country, China, is a victor nation, together with other allied countries like the United States. So never talk to me about Japan developing nuclear weapons. If they do that, that will be the moment of their annihilation, because they will constitute threat to China, and China has all the power and the authorization to destroy that new menace from Japan. China will never allow Japan to become another militaristic or fascist country because of the prohibition of the United Nations Charter. And that is part of the condition upon which Japan unconditionally surrendered. And no one should even think about Japan raising its head of fascism again to threaten China.
So, I mean, if you don't want to unravel the post-war security order in East Asia, then preserve the current status of Taiwan and carry on with business as usual. I think that Victor has made a very strong case there for preventing a whole series of unforeseen consequences from China attempting to change the status quo over Taiwan.
Allow me to add a point. I think to preserve the legacy of the Second World War is to make sure China is a united country. And no one should indulge in the fantasy that China should ever be separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Meaning, to achieve national unity for China is a precondition of preserving the victory legacy of the Second World War. If you argue with me otherwise, you either don't read history or you are misguided by your misperception of the realities of the world. If any one country wants to fight militarily against China to prevent China's reunification, he or she will be doomed to failure. If you ever want to try that, then you are really playing peril for yourself.
Could I ask a question of Victor?
Yeah,
Victor, do you think
as far as the United Nations enemy state clause, many experts do consider that obsolete, and even China voted for a resolution affirming that it was obsolete, and that vote was in the 1990s. So whether or not it still applies is actually it's kind of an unresolved legal question at the moment. But I do think that the likelihood of Japan developing nuclear weapons in the near term is highly unlikely. However, the reality is that Japan is significantly increasing its defense budget. They've been doing so ever since Abe came back as prime minister in 2012, and that's continued under Abe's successors since 2020. They've changed their prime minister multiple times, but it's clear that the trajectory is for increased spending, not just by Japan, but again, as I said, by other countries in the region. So we are in an arms race here in Asia.
Please allow me to mention something obsolete without being terminated still is not terminated. Therefore, allow me to emphasize for your benefit, as well as the benefit of our audience, that the United Nations Charter Enemy Clause remains on the book, and it can be triggered if Japan wants to move in the wrong direction of rearmament and remilitarization to such an extent that it constitutes a threat to China. China will go to war with Japan if Japan wants to rearm itself, as well as even possessing the nuclear weapon, because that is the right authorized by the victor nations as reflected in the enemy clause in the United Nations Charter. Don't be misguided about the so-called obsolete of that clause. That clause remains.
Well, it does. I mean, we're all kind of getting a bit hypothetical here. I mean, my question, my comments about, the next stage all followed from, a forcible change of the status quo over Taiwan. And saying that if the status quo does change, then I think, it will trigger a whole load of other moves, by the regional powers, by Japan, by South Korea, and, presumably, wider than that as well. But I do think there's an interesting question here. I mean, given that it's, so long since, China, the mainland, actually ruled Taiwan, I just wonder, asking Victor, hypothetically, do you think that the Irish are a different group of people, a different nation to the British, Victor?
You are completely wrong. The better comparison is the United Nations versus the Confederation. There was only one country, that is the United States of America. The Confederation wants to break away from the Union. And if you test the opinion at that time, probably up to 100% of the people in the Confederation wanted to break away from the Union. Why President Lincoln was ranked as one of the greatest presidents of the United States. He refused to accept that. He wants to use force to bring back the Confederation into the Union. Therefore, as you can see, President Lincoln and the Federation won. The Confederation was defeated. They were brought back into the Union by force. by defeating the Confederation. This is a better comparison for the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China will never allow breakaway of Taiwan because if you read the Potsdam Proclamation and the Cairo Declaration, Taiwan in its entirety should be returned to China upon the unconditional surrender of Japan. And it was returned. Now, there was a civil war afterwards, but there was only one China. China being separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, that is a fact. But there is only one China. And if Taiwan wants to break away from China, China will need to bring them back into China by force, as President Lincoln did vis-a-vis the Confederation. That is not aggression. That is not using force against another country. That is civil war, as the civil war in the United States. Thereafter, the United States has always been one country under God, indivisible. China should always be indivisible after the reunification of Taiwan.
Yeah, but I think if we went back 120 years when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and we can see that things change. And if people decide that they are a nation and that they deserve self-determination, well, why shouldn't they have self-determination?
Allow me to emphasize, what the British or the English or the Irish want to do, it's their business. What the Chinese want to do here on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, it is our business. As I declared just now, there is only one China. If you go back to Ireland and ask your government whether they recognize two China or one China, one Taiwan, you will be informed that they recognize only one China. They recognize that Taiwan is part of China, and China has full authorization as a sovereign country to deal with a part of its territory which wants to break away. And the better principle you need to keep in your mind is what President Lincoln did with the Confederation. Whatever Lincoln did to the Confederation, China has the right to do the same for the so-called breakaway Taiwan province.
Well, for many people, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Consistent with what Victor has said, people here know that a unilateral declaration of independence, if, for example, the government and the people had a consensus that they were going to change the name from Republic of China to the Republic of Taiwan, and this is what people typically call formal independence. I think people here know that the most likely outcome of that would be an immediate Chinese attack. At the same time, the number of people here who are saying we want to reunify with China on China's terms, which is similar to what China offered or implemented in Hong Kong and Macau, one country, two systems. The number of people here who support that as a short-term occurrence is very small, which means most people here, for now, prefer the status quo. But there is an interesting aspect to this, and it does go to your question. They do have elections here. And over the past nearly 30 years of democratic elections, the electorate has switched back and forth a few times. They've elected more independence-minded leaders, and they've also elected leaders who preferred a closer relationship with China and adamantly opposed Taiwan independence and emphatically believe that Taiwan is part of one China. And the voters elected a leader like that two times in recent decades, in 2008 and 2012. But in 2016 and 2020, the voters emphatically elected a more independence-minded leader. And in 2024, it was a really strange result because the independence-minded leader was elected with only 40% of the vote because the other 60% was split between two candidates who were more moderate when it came to dealing with China. So it actually shows that, at least at the moment, the majority seems to be just wanting some moderation. They don't want to go for independence because they're concerned about a immediate Chinese use of force. But they don't want to unify either. And it seems that now they want to get along with China. I think at the moment, one could say that the public is a little concerned with some of the moves that the government has made that may have inflamed tensions. There are many people who support the government wholeheartedly, but it does seem at the moment that there's a trend to say, well, maybe we need to get along better with China.
In order to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, the United States broke off all these points. They decided to withdraw all the U.S. troops stationed in Taiwan back out of Taiwan. They broke off diplomatic recognition with Taiwan. They even rescinded the U.S. ROC Defense Treaty, which was a domestic law in the United States. They did all the impossibilities in order to do what? To normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. Now, yes, of course, the United States is still supplying weapons to Taiwan, but do you know where will be these weapons after the reunification? Most of these weapons, if not destroyed, will be on display in a military museum, either somewhere in Taiwan or in mainland China. Therefore, if you think that the weapons supplied to Taiwan by the United States will enable the separatists in Taiwan to defeat China, you are indulging in fantasy. The United States publicly acknowledges, in terms of a conventional weapon, the Chinese conventional weapons are not inferior to the United States. They are actually, in many cases, already superior to the US weapons. In terms of other weapons, China's weapons are ahead of the United States. For example, President Trump is talking about F-47, for example, the sixth generation of the Phantom stealth planes. China is already producing two types of that from two manufacturers, one in Chengdu, the other one in Shenyang. And if the United States does not have the supply of rare earth from China, their defense industry will grind down to a halt. So don't think, if you think about the war between China and the United States will win the war. What if they don't? What if they lose the war? Especially in the war close to the Chinese coastline, and every inch of land in Taiwan is fully covered by the long-range artillery pieces in Fujian, in Guangdong, and in Zhejiang. So you are talking about a completely one-sided war if the war ever breaks out. Let's all use our sanity to propose peace rather than agitating for war. The war will be quick. It will be very, very swift, and the result will not be surprising at all. And if you are betting on the wrong side of the equation, what if you are on the wrong side? What if you are on the losing side? That is the moment of truth. We all need to think about it. And China will never take any military action unless it is fully believed, fully convinced it is on the right side of history.
Okay.
What will make China to reach that conviction? To achieve national unity is always the right thing for China to do. And to defend and preserve the victory legacy of the Second World War after defeating Japanese fascism is always the right thing to do. If you are a British or an Australian, don't forget all the atrocities and the crimes against humanity, against your nationals and humanity as a whole committed by the Japanese fascism in the Second World War.